These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands, groove with the rhythm.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, a conversation with Dr. Msia Kibona Clark on her recently published Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers. Africa World Now Project is next.
We have a new song, and we'd like to feature on this a great friend and a great musician from Ghana. He's fantastic.
Come together in love and perfect unity.
Right on.
Diaspora radical, diaspora radical.
Hip-hop as a cultural product of Africa and African-descended peoples is a rich field of inquiry. Hip-hop is a viable platform that highlights calls for social change as the life-giving breath of hip-hop. Nevertheless, a viable work that dives deep into the sociopolitical and philosophical foundations of hip-hop as a human expression of African futures is still yet to be written. Most work on hip-hop is still grasping with it at its surface level, still justifying its existence. Resisting the clutches of the ever-evolving attempts of racial capitalism to control it, hip-hop as the historical and ancestral culmination of art, philosophy, politics, collectivism, questions of humanity, is simultaneously evolving. Africa, as Dr. Msia Clark writes in her book, Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers, is where the origins of hip-hop can be found. According to Msia, when Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and enslaved, they carried with them their human traditions, their cultural traditions that linked them with heaven and earth. One of these traditions were the rhythmic meditations on life, love, politics, the future. We call it music. These traditions were forged in the conditions within which those Africans found themselves, the Americas, North, South, Central, to become jazz, the blues, gospels, and of course, hip-hop. Therefore, to understand the roots of hip-hop in Africa, its origins, adds a breadth and depth to studying hip-hop that is vital to understand its salience and ability to invent the future. Throughout Africa, artists use hip-hop both to describe their lives and to create shared spaces for uncensored social commentary, feminist challenges to patriarchy, and resistance against state institutions, while at the same time engaging with the global hip-hop community. In Hip Hop in Africa, Msia Kibona Clark examines how hip-hop helps us understand specifically African narratives of social, political, and economic realities. Clark looks at the use of hip-hop in protest both as a means of articulating social problems and as a tool for mobilizing listeners around those problems. She also details the spread of hip-hop culture in Africa following its emergence in the United States, assessing the impact of urbanization and demographics on the spread of hip-hop culture. Hip-hop in Africa is a tribute to a genre and its artists, as well as a timely examination that pushes the study of music and the African diaspora in critical new directions. Written to be accessible from foremost experts to one that is simply interested in African hip-hop, this book will easily find its place in any environment that seriously wants to understand Africa and diasporic youth contributions to world history. In fact, it provides a compass to find the direction towards the future. What we will hear next is a recent conversation I had with Dr. Msia Clark on her recently published book, Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers. Dr. Msia Kibona Clark is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. She is originally from Tanzania and received her doctorate in African Studies from Howard University in 2006. Her research has focused on African migration and identity, as well as hip-hop and popular culture in Africa. Dr. Clark has published several scholarly publications on African migration, African African immigrant identities, relations between African migrants and African Americans, and hip-hop culture's intersections with social change, gender, and politics in Africa. She has published 2 books, Hip Hop and Social Change in Africa and Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers, and over 10 scholarly articles and book chapters, and currently produces the Hip Hop African blog and monthly podcast hosted at hiphopafrican.com. Dr. Clark is also an accomplished photographer. She has participated in exhibitions in Tanzania and the U.S. Her work is also featured in the book project MUFON, Women Photographers in the African Diaspora. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities of Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
I know you want me gone, you'll be gone for a minute. I'm riding on this song, and I'm riding in a minute.
Yeah, okay. I would like to thank sponsors of this event. Of course, Sankofa Books and Video, who are giving us this space for this important space here in Washington, D.C., but also this particular work, Hip Hop in Africa, by Msia Clark here. Africa Will Now Project, which I'm a part of, and my partner, Louisa Mutali, who's a part of as well. Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity, and Institute for Policy Studies. So let's give a round of applause for being here today to celebrate this very, very important book that Msia has actually written for us to think about. Just a quick introduction of myself. My name is James Pope. I'm with Africa World Now Project, but also an assistant professor down in Winston-Salem State University. And I've known Msia for a little while. We've been on panels. We've talked Howard grad and all that other particular stuff. But what I wanted to do as far as the format of this particular talk, one of the things that I like to do is be real organic in how we deal with a lot of this information. Yes, we have so-called experts, but also we want to make sure that knowledge is something, and intellectuals are something that we all are. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to throw out a few questions, and then we're going to throw it to the audience and kind of have a discussion, a public discussion of this particular book that Msia has written, which is a very, very important book. I had the chance to read this book. Throw this first question out to Msia. Please contextualize this book. What are some of the primary themes that you want the reader to have in mind as they engage your work?
Well, so excuse me, I have a bit of a cold today, so bear with me. But for me, the book started out as wanting to have a platform to showcase the images and kind of the culture, hip-hop culture in Africa, but it was also important to create something, to write something that was part of the culture, part of hip-hop culture. And so I think as academics, we often get kind of caught up in wanting, to publish, get promoted, all of these things. And being someone who grew up in hip-hop culture in the U.S., and I think it's, looking at what U.S. hip-hop scholars have done, it was kind of like, okay, now's an opportunity to do this on the continent. And so I wanted it to be something that was representative of the culture, that came from hip-hop culture, that happened to be published in academia, but that it was tied to the culture. And so, and a big part of it was basically, it's a Pan-African project in the sense that it's like, of course, hip-hop is Pan-African. Of course, hip-hop is African music. It's kind of an iteration of African music. And so it was starting from there and then dealing with gender, dealing with immigration, dealing with political and social commentary. So it was kind of starting off with the platform of hip-hop's African roots and then kind of going out from there.
And you mentioned, you talk a lot early on, and specifically in the first chapter, you talk about this idea of cultural representation, and you talk about a cultural appropriation. And scholars and scholarship on hip-hop in Africa tend to focus on mimicking, I guess you should say. They talk about the African hip hop is actually mimicking United States hip hop. Could you talk a little bit about, because there's something that you said in your book that I thought was very important. You said, how can you appropriate your own culture?
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned that in your book, and I want you to talk a little bit more about, how you're dealing with that. You talk about culture and you're using culture as that platform. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, it's, that I think that's also one of the things, seeing what was being published, and, people on the continent read. And so folks, friends of mine in Tanzania, artists would be like, did you read that article that came out? It was BS, yada, yada, yada. And so you need to write something. And I was like, nah, I'm doing immigration. I'm not really, And so it was seeing the stuff that was coming out, and it was putting hip-hop as this thing that Africans were imitating African Americans, that hip-hop culture in Africa was completely disconnected from global hip-hop culture. It was, but a lot of these artists in the video, you talk to them, they can tell you off top the 5 elements of hip-hop. They know who DJ Kool Herc is. And when you look at Pan-Africanism, one of the things again, bringing this in is, 1, you can't appropriate your own culture, but 2, when we think of Pan-Africanism, we usually think of it as a diaspora reflecting on its African past. And we very rarely look at how Africa reflects on the diaspora, and I think that's what hip-hop is. These are MCs on the continent looking at their brothers and sisters through hip-hop culture, kind of jumping in a cipher and kind of giving their perspective of what's happening in their locality, but are very clear of their connection with the diaspora through hip-hop culture.
And on the ground and on the continent of Africa, dealing with that, and that's a very important point that you're making as far as like Africa looking at the diaspora, which we don't necessarily have. There's writing, there are people doing it. I'm looking at it that way, but not necessarily in a dominant. What is distinct about hip hop? What is distinct about African hip hop? Or should we be even concerned about the distinction of an African hip hop?
Yeah, that was one of the things, I think, again, as an academic, we often come in like, we're going to define people and label them. And I think one of the things there were a couple things I had to move away from, and it's kind of using African hip hop as a label was something that, in some cases, I use it to describe the type of hip hop or the location that hip hop was. But rather, I tried to be careful not to then, again, separate it from what was going on here. So there were a couple terms. There was another term, femc, which I learned from a lot of female artists, like, no, I don't like that term. So I was like, okay. So I had to go back and delete, and reconceptualize stuff again so that it was more representative. But yeah, that's definitely something that I had to kind of, be humble and say, okay, you know what, this is creating this divide, and I don't want that. So I have to kind of try to be thoughtful with that.
And that's important, because even when we think about the title of your book, right, we think about the title, Hip Hop in Africa. But then we look at the subtitle, you have Prophets of the City and the Dustyfoot Philosophers. Talk about that a little bit more in choosing that, because of course as academics, we try to conceptualize these long titles to try to capture everything. Talk a little bit more about, because Dustyfoot Philosophers really rings out to me as a person who studies philosophy, the worldview of people, and how that formulates itself into a critical consciousness to respond to social inequities, to respond to social conditions. Talk a little bit more about, Dustyfoot Philosophers, Prophets of the City.
That honestly came from 2 projects that were hugely influential. So Prophets of the City is a name of a pioneering group out of South Africa, out of Cape Town. So they're one of the first hip-hop groups. South Africa was one of the first countries to really start doing hip-hop in the township of Cape Flats in Mitchell's Plain, and they were one of the groups, and they spoke out against apartheid. Of course, they were kind of marginalized from the mainstream anti-apartheid movement, and so Prophets of the City, they spelled, instead of T-H-E, they used D-A. And then Dustyfoot Philosophers was the name of Kanon's first album. And so, and I think I don't know how many times I played that album, but both, I wanted to kind of pay homage to artists and songs and projects that were influential in this. And then I think that, both looking at Prophets of the City and looking at the names of it and looking at how these artists have influence. I've often said that the next, I think the next Fela out of Africa is going to be an MC. And you look at artists like Bliss the Ambassador and you kind of see some of that Fela-esqueness. And so this idea that these hip-hop artists are prophets and philosophers and that they're speaking on social issues, political issues, religion, gender, all of these things. So that was why I kind of went with those subtitles.
And it's interesting that you say Fela. It's like you're reading my mind here. You're looking at my notes on it. Look at my book here. But Fela, you mentioned Fela. Fela is Fela Kuti is he sampled a lot in hip hop. And you have a section that you talk about that, how important is African music, specifically when we think about hip hop, we're talking about elements and a fusion of genres of music. Fela influenced Mos Def and others. You talk about that a little bit. And we talk about the elements of culture. We talk about the elements, we might say Fela, but can you talk a little bit more about hip hop here in the United States that are sampling a lot of African artists?
Yeah, I think when I found that out, I found out that Fela was the most sampled African artist in American hip hop through the research. Because there's some websites where you can kind of see who sampled what. And it was like artists like Missy Elliott and artists that you don't kind of, put in the conscious MC category. And so, but then also Fela's music is heavily influenced by the funk scene in LA and the Black Panthers. So you've got this kind of, rather than looking at someone, again, appropriating, it's more of a cycle of black music. And so, of course, MCs here would, like Fela stuff. And so even when you look at the play Fela that was co-produced by Jay-Z and Will Smith, that connection is there. And I think that when you kind of look at black music, there's always been kind of, this back and forth, this relationship, this conversation that happens. And so, the continent will, produce something. Chuck D has been really vocal online about the, power of hip-hop in Africa. So I think, I think that kind of Africanness that we have in terms of, gravitating towards African music, I think that's why artists here, like to sample, because it's, it's home.
Yeah. There's some familiarity to it.
Yes.
Right? So that deep cultural structure that is there. You talk about migrations, you talk about language, of course you talk about cultural representation. What is the role of the African city and its metropolis in coagulating the diversity of African cultural expression that forges itself into African hip-hop?
The city has been, just like, here when you look at the South Bronx or even Compton or Atlanta, the city has kind of been this place that has attracted a lot of people. In Africa, of course, urbanization rates are really high. Many African countries are majority youth populations, and so you've got all these youth gravitating to the cities, no jobs, crowded housing, few educational opportunities, and here's this music coming up, where they're talking about the South Bronx, but it sounds an awful lot like Dakar or Lagos, and so youth kind of gravitating, even looking at police brutality. Because if you look at the police as a tool of capitalism, it doesn't matter what race they are. And so the police in Lagos are going to behave just as inappropriately as the police in Southeast. And so I think hearing that, it's like, okay, like fuck the police. It was just like, yeah, especially in South Africa under apartheid where you have those layers. So yeah, I definitely think, yeah.
Women in African hip hop. You mention it, you talk about it, and actually understanding the role of women specifically in African hip hop, there's a huge role there.
Yeah.
Could you talk about a little bit before I kind of throw it out to the audience for their responses or questions? Could you talk a little bit about the role of women in African hip hop? And you mentioned what is it? MC. They
Femc,
call it Femc,
yeah. Femc, yeah.
Femc, I gotta say feminista, but Femc. Could you talk a little bit more about women in African hip hop, because there's a strong presence of African women across in the regions of Africa as well.
Yeah, well, initially I would go to Ghana. When I first kind of went to Ghana, I'm like, where are the women? Oh, there's no women, they're just playing, or they're doing other stuff. Senegal, same thing, and so it was, I started hearing stuff like as I'm going online looking for music, and one of the things that's really helped is having, students, basically say, go find music, and they'll find, and so like a student found this artist in Cape Town, Dope St. Jude, who's a queer artist in Cape Town. I was like, what? Like, I didn't even know, she existed. And then me having to, again, reorient my framework into understanding, like, no term FemC, it basically qualifies MC. They want to be known as MCs, period. And not this whole queen of or first lady business, but as equals to men, but also looking at some of the issues that they have to deal with. So in dealing with the respectability politics, and that was a lot, even for myself, kind of having to deal with my own kind of, maybe my own conservatism in some ways. And looking at some of these women and some of the things that they were saying, I'm like, oh, that's kind of sexual. But it's also looking at some of these women making decisions about how to represent their sexuality that is not bound by, like, within hip hop, one of the things that's sometimes frustrating is even the conscious artists want to put women in kind of the queen mother role, the, Lauryn Hill prototype. That's what they want. And that's the only type of woman MC that they will validate as a real MC. And so you had MCs that were fire on the mic, but men were like, no, she's not conscious, she's not. But you're not disqualifying these brothers over here who were talking similar stuff, so it was definitely good. I mean, the FemC, and looking at women MCs, there was an artist, I was on Facebook writing about going to South Africa and how I was excited to meet some female MCs, and this one artist, Nazli Safe, didn't know me, but someone tagged her in it, and she sent me a message, like, taking issue with my gender-specific pronouns, and I was like, oh, okay, so I gotta, I need to consider these things, and also women in dealing with their sexuality when it's not heterosexuality, looking at the different ways in which women use subtext to express themselves. So yeah, I think I learned a lot more, and grew a lot more as a scholar in that chapter because of my own kind of ideas and misconceptions.
That's important. I wanted to open it up to the audience as well. Like I said, I wanted this to be, because I have many, many questions. I don't want it to be a dominated conversation, but I wanted to open it up to the audience. If there's any questions, any, that we can deal with, that Sia can deal with specifically about her work, but also, looking at hip hop in Africa, but we would call it the African world as well. And if you raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you. And if you want to think about a question, I have a question I can ask.
So in your book, thank you for your book. In your book, you make a number of references to the coded language of hip hop. And I just needed you to explain that a little bit more. And also, you had also just now had talked about subtext and respectability politics. If you could just explain those concepts a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like I'm originally from Tanzania, and a dictionary won't help you translate hip hop in Tanzania. In fact, one of the pushbacks from a reviewer, they took issue with my translations, specifically the Swahili translations, but it was the artist himself who gave me the translation, the artist who was fluent in English. And so a lot of the times, the music is speaking to the youth, and it's speaking a language that comes from the street. and it comes from inner city communities, and it really, in many cases, you really have to understand the cultural context that it comes from to really understand what these artists are saying. And so, in some cases, artists would say things, and in Swahili, and I, think of the translation. Is this what they're saying? And they were like, no, this actually means this. And if we're living in Dar, in these communities, you would know that. And I'm like, okay, so it definitely, that's, and so even with the subtext in terms of sexuality, there was one specific artist out of Johannesburg who is a queer artist, and so in her music, she makes reference to her queer identity. And so I was able to, because she mixes Zulu and English, and so I was able to kind of read that subtext. But in my analysis, I actually gave her my analysis of her song and said, is this accurate? And two, is it okay if I publish this? And so she was like, yeah, I mean, it is. That's pretty much what I'm saying. I'm kind of blurring the gender lines, and it's okay that, you publish it. So a lot of the times, I mean, just like hip hop here, if you take out the profanity, I could play some of this for, certain populations in the U.S. and they would have no idea what the artists were saying and would just kind of like completely, it would sound like mumbo jumbo. It wouldn't sound like anything. And so I think that's what it is. I mean, a lot of it is rooted in those communities. And even Tanzanians who've been in the U.S. for a long time, they go back and they hear the music, and some of them don't know what the references are. So because language is changing and growing, and Pidgin English is the same way. If you're not on the ground, you may not, a lot of things you may get missed because you're not there in that community.
That language and the translation, you talk about authenticity, and that's very important to the artist.
Yes, very.
I just wanted to ask a question. By saying that African hip hop sort of less doesn't have the ability, I would say in history didn't mimic U.S. Hip hop, right? It would not discredit groups out of Nigeria. Emphasis, who actually did go about to create that distinction that this is U.S. and this is African art, and although it may sit under the same umbrella of hip hop, does it not discredit the fact that they went out their way to create that divergence? Because previous to that point, hip hop did mimic the beginning, and when they came after that, that's when you can look at African hip hop and see the distinction.
Yeah, and I think, even now, there are some artists that if you go on YouTube and look at hip-hop videos from Africa, you'll find, one of the things in Tanzania that's frustrating is when I see videos of artists wearing Timberland boots. And I'm like, why are you wearing Timberland boots? There's no reason. There's nowhere in Tanzania where you need Timberland. You're not climbing a mountain. And so you do have kind of this, and one of the other things that was frustrating over the summer, last summer, talking to some Tanzanian artists, because there's a group of Tanzanian artists that are now pushing to produce their music in English, because Tanzania was pretty much all Swahili hip hop scene. And we talked about the N-word, and these young artists, 20 years old, 19, 20, basically had no concept of the history of it. And they were like, oh, anybody can use it. It's no big deal. And it's a word. And it's just it took a lot. Cause I didn't want to go into teacher mode, cause we're, having a conversation. And it was interesting in that particular, one of those conversations, there was a white gentleman from the U.S. who was hanging out with these MCs, and he actually stood up and was like, no, it's not okay for me to use that word. No matter how much I think I'm progressive, it's never okay for me to use it. And so they were just kind of looking like, oh, and it was a weird moment. But there are times like that where it does become frustrating, where there is a lot of kind of imitation without understanding the history of it. But I do agree that there is that kind of that need to create your own local sound. And so hip hop in Dar es Salaam Tanzania is going to sound different than hip hop in Arusha, Tanzania. And hip hop in Cape Town is going to sound different than hip hop in Johannesburg. So there is that need to kind of create this local sound. And it's just like here, Atlanta hip hop sounds different from LA hip hop. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and that latter point is very important, those distinctions, even with here in the context. But also think about, and I think what Sia is attempting to do is we're pulling from the same.
Intellectual and philosophical. Me one time for your mind, now. Time for your mind, one time. Yeah,
we are currently listening to a public conversation I recently had with Dr. Msia Clark on her recently published book, Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers. Throughout Africa, artists use hip-hop both to describe their lives and to create shared spaces for uncensored social commentary, feminist challenges to patriarchy, and resistance to state institutions, while at the same time engaging with the global hip-hop community. In Hip Hop in Africa, Msia Kibona Clark examines how hip-hop helps us understand specifically African narratives of social, political, and economic realities. Dr. Clark looks at the use of hip-hop in protest both as a means of articulating social problems and as a tool for mobilizing listeners around those problems. She also details the spread of hip-hop culture in Africa following its emergence in the United States, assessing the impact of urbanization and demographics on the spread of hip-hop culture. Written to be accessible from foremost experts to one that is simply interested in African hip-hop, this book will easily find its place in any environment that seriously wants to understand African and diasporic youth contributions to world history. In fact, it provides a compass to find the direction to the future. Dr. Msia Kibona Clark is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. She is originally from Tanzania and received her doctorate in African Studies from Howard University in 2006. Her research is focused on African migration and identity, as well as hip-hop and popular culture in Africa. Dr. Clark has published several scholarly publications on African migration, African immigrant identities, relations between African migrants and African Americans, and hip-hop culture's intersection with social change, gender, and politics in Africa. She has published 2 books, Hip Hop and Social Change in Africa, and also the current book, Hip Hop in Africa, Prophets of the City and Dustyfoot Philosophers, and over 10 scholarly articles and book chapters, and currently produces the Hip Hop African blog and monthly podcast hosted at hiphopafrican.com. Dr. Clark is also an accomplished photographer. She has participated in exhibitions in Tanzania and the U.S. Her work was also featured in the book project MUFON, Women Photographers of the African Diaspora. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the program.
From the same African experience. It's just the different manifestations of that. And the authenticity comes in at the local level, connected to the global.
Yeah, I mean, hip-hop is all about, the locality. So there's a saying in political science, all politics is local, all hip-hop is local. And so I often give the example of Madonna, how she's from Detroit, but that's insignificant to her music. But Eminem being from Detroit is a big part of who he is. Lil Wayne being from New Orleans, Jay-Z being from Brooklyn, these are all extremely important parts of who these artists are, what they talk about, the music they sample. The funk scene has been influential in West Coast hip-hop from NWA to Kendrick Lamar. So it's, hip hop, you have to represent who you are, where you're from, your experiences in your locality. And so I think that's really important. One of the important things about hip hop.
And see, I wanted to also, while we're queuing up more questions, I also wanted to talk about the mimicking aspect of African hip hop a little bit. Let's unwrap that a little bit more, because a lot of the mainstream hip hop here in the United States has a certain capitalist fringe to it, right? I shouldn't say certain. That is the root of it, right? And so when you got African artists who are mimicking those particular things, what are other artists saying in the context of because what I'm getting at here is this protest and combat literature. Right. That's what I'm pulling on directly from here. Could you talk a little bit more about those contrasts?
That section of the book. So there's a chapter that talks about socially conscious music out of Africa and kind of how artists engage the political structures, and Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth was one of my favorite books. And there's a part in there where he talks about protest culture versus combat culture. And where protest culture, you're basically talking to your oppressor, complaining about your conditions, saying, woe is me. The oppressor encourages this because it allows you to get it off your chest. And then you go home and, combat culture, you're actually talking to the people. And you're saying, okay, let's get up and do this. And so in Senegal, in Tunisia, with the Arab Spring, and in Egypt, excuse me, you had artists that were talking to the people. In Burkina Faso, artists that were talking to the people saying, get out, vote, come to the streets, come to Tahrir Square, come to wherever. And that's scary for the political structure, because it means you're ready to mobilize, but you have to go through the protest stage to get to the combat stage, because the protest stage articulates what the issues are, what the grievances are, and very few artists get to the combat stage. We could all talk about conscious artists that produce protest music, but very few are actually saying, okay, here's a blueprint of what we need to do. And so that was important because I wanted to recognize the work of the artists that were providing social commentary, but also acknowledge those like Kibona from Senegal that was involved in the Enough is Enough movement that registered over 300,000 youth to vote and got the president voted out of office. That's different than, kind of talking about corruption and, you stole our money. Kibona is kind of like, okay, well, now what are we going to do about it? Let's do this. That was kind of wanting to make that distinction.
So my question is, where do you see the femc culture going socially and politically for Africans in the diaspora, both in the U.S. and in Africa?
So women artists, women in hip-hop, I think there are so many universals with women in hip-hop. Everywhere, women are the minority in hip-hop in terms of artists. But there are a lot of, the artist Yugen Blackrock, who has a feature on the Black Panther soundtrack. That's gotten her a lot of exposure. One of her favorite artists is Sha Rock, who's from D.C., who went to Howard. Really amazing MC. And so it's interesting because I follow both of them on Twitter, and I've seen them like each other's stuff and comment. I'm like, yes, collaborate, and it's like I'm definitely with, looking at more artists collaborating, male and female, but looking at a lot of the women out there who are really strong lyricists and kind of really hoping to see more collaboration. And really hoping to see more artists kind of getting involved in projects together, and kind of, supporting one another and those things.
I have a question. So I'm wondering if you could, because I know in Burkina Faso they just had this change of a government not too long ago, and from what I understand, an integral part of that movement was music and also particularly hip-hop, like the artist Smokey. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that, not just in Burkina Faso, but anywhere when it comes to, movement building.
Yeah, that's been, Francophone Africa is, really has been doing a lot. So with Senegal, the actions in Senegal influenced the artists and folks in Burkina Faso. And they were definitely in support of Senegalese artists and activists were in support of what was happening in Burkina Faso. And then once the Burkina Faso revolution happened, Senegalese and Burkina Faso folks, activists, were supportive of what was going on in the Congo. Some of them went to the Congo, got deported, and so one of the artists that I interviewed for the project, Chat from Kibona, basically was like, I asked him, is it difficult kind of going and kind of spreading this movement, because he saw Yanamar as a Pan-African movement. And he was like, well, I'm an artist, and so the government just, they just think I'm coming to do a concert. And so that's how I get in. And then, he got deported after the government realized that, they had some other agendas. But one of the things that he was saying is that there is a network of artists. A lot of them have, these WhatsApp groups. So it's really, basic stuff where they will communicate about what's going on locally. And so even on, the Lusophone artists, so the Angolan artists, there's been a lot of stuff happening in Angola. There's one artist, MC Kappa, that was arrested on house arrest. And so some of his colleagues have been working with Brazilian artists who were, recently protesting the assassination of the one activist. I can't remember her name right now. So you've got this Angola-Brazil connection happening. And so you have the Francophone connection happening. So it's interesting that through social media, I think a lot of these artists and activists are getting together. Even in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, there's a hip-hop conference that happens every December in Uganda, and they bring in artists from Congo, Tanzania, and Kenya, and they're all about, talking about Swahili and Lingala, and, so you're having these networks of artists coming together, and I think that's really, really hopeful and encouraging to see that happening.
So while we're queuing up another question from the audience, I was thinking specifically about having going to Africa, taking students to Africa, specifically, I shouldn't say Africa, so specifically to Kenya and places like that, and working with a lot of the graffiti artists and a lot of the artists. When we talk about the elements of hip-hop, how are, and also we also know that there are a lot of festivals, I'm thinking specifically of Chale Wote in Ghana, who are taking this cultural form of hip-hop to something beyond, moving hip-hop beyond, because I often say, just having experience on the ground in the continent, dealing with young folk, they're doing something else with hip hop. There, could you talk a little bit about some of the examples that is happening?
Yeah, I mean, Chale Wote, I haven't been able to attend. I've been to the location where it happens and, seeing the graffiti. That's one of the festivals I really, really want to go to. But Chale Wote has really, incorporated a lot of the different elements of hip-hop. You also have Festigraph in Senegal, which is the only graffiti festival in Africa. I think it happens every other year, every 3 years. You have several organizations and groups doing stuff in South Africa. Tanzania, they have Okoa Mtai in Arusha, which is like, it's kind of, people compare it like to the New York of hip-hop in terms of Tanzania, because they take it very, very seriously. And a lot of that is because of the location. In Arusha, the two former Black Panthers, Charlotte and Pete O'Neill, are in Arusha. And if you haven't heard their story, I mean, it's definitely something that you should look at. I mean, there have been 2 documentaries on both, one on Pete O'Neill, one on Charlotte O'Neill. But they've been very active in the hip hop scene in Arusha, and they can be credited with one of the reasons why the hip hop scene in Arusha is much more serious and much more political than the hip hop scene in Dar es Salaam. They've opened up their community center to artists. They've sat down with artists, mentored artists. So you've got a lot of these things happening, and it's not just in terms of rap, but it's also in terms of graffiti, and it's also in terms of breakdancing and DJing. In some places like Senegal, graffiti is not illegal, and so that has kind of encouraged the graffiti scene more. All the elements are really there, and then the element of knowledge, throwing in some of the quotes into the clip. These artists are also kind of transmitting knowledge. They're also taking that issue or that aspect or that element of hip hop seriously.
Hands.
While we wait for another question to queue up.
I believe there's questions in people's mind. They just like a little timid.
I'm trying to pull it out by asking. Hopefully you like, we get one in before we get like.
There we go.
There we go. All right, there we go.
Thanks for the book. South Africa is a very weird country, when it comes to race and classification. So would you tell us a bit about the difference in the hip-hop scene between Cape Town, which is predominantly colored, and Johannesburg, which would be more African? And then secondly, would you, are there any reasons or that hip-hop is less popular in rural areas than in the cities?
That was, in terms of the racial dynamics in South Africa, was all, every time I go, I'm like, okay. I thought I knew, understood. Because there would be folks, and I'm sitting down, in Cape Town specifically, and as an artist, I'm like, okay, they're Black, and to find out they identify as colored, and I'm like, how? Like, but it's like, okay. I also, there was an artist that one of the artists is colored in Cape Town that, was talked about when Mos Def, Dead Prez, I guess, and Talib Kweli came to Cape Town to do a tour. And I don't know which one of these artists, but I think it was M1 from Dead Prez, basically went off on the colors. You don't want to admit that you're black and this is messed up and basically just kind of really talking about colored identities and saying that they're just people who don't want to say that they're black. And really simplifying it. And so then, of course, you're in Cape Town, which, what's his name is called the Colored Factory. So it's not my words. It's, God, I can't remember the comedian's name right now. But Trevor Noah. And, the hip-hop scene started in the colored townships. And so even kind of me going into that, okay, I'm like, okay, so I'm hearing what their critique of these conscious artists. And so I'm like, okay. So I'm trying to leave my own kind of ideas of race behind. But it was tough. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that's not said. And there's a lot of stuff that, because when you go to Joburg, you definitely see the difference in terms of the artists. And, as soon as you go into the hip hop scene in Cape Town and you see, predominantly colored community, there are black people in Cape Town, but then you go to another area to hang out with the black hip hop heads. And so it's like, there's some overlap, but it's like, and I'm not comfortable enough in that space to kind of be like, what's up? Because I'm still learning about and I think you've called me out a couple times on always going to Cape Town and not going to Durban, which I definitely need to do. And there was I think with the cities, I think, hip hop started off as an urban, it's predominantly urban in terms of its structure and in terms of kind of, having all these youth in one place. So you have artists in the rural areas or youth in the rural areas who listen to the music, but it's more difficult to kind of pull together. But you do, like in South Africa, it's all in the city. So whether it's Durban or Joburg or Cape Town, but in the villages, it's a lot. I don't know, yeah.
Thank you so much for your work. So again, kind of thinking about the South African context, because my introduction to African hip hop was actually living in South Africa. And it was like 2005, and a lot of people in Durban weren't really into hip hop. It was like house music, everywhere house music, which was really confusing for me too. I was like, what is going on? But in the context of Durban, and then you see sort of this spread, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, you see this spread of hip hop really sort of taking over and being part of the mainstream. At that time, it wasn't mainstream. So you had hip hop heads that were very much really sort of still holding on and really, reproducing those principles of hip hop. So MCing, graph, DJing, and b-boying and things like that. But what I'm really interested in is actually thinking about the ways that female MCs, especially the young artist that you have on the cover, people talk a lot about, she raps in Xhosa and talk a lot about, she has like this spiritual quality, almost like as if a go-go, right? Yeah. So thinking about the ways in which African women as MCs are getting us to think about Africana spirituality in a very different way.
No, yeah, it's definitely... It's interesting because a lot of the hip-hop scenes are not mainstream. So in Tanzania, bongo flavor, if you look up Tanzanian hip-hop, you're going to probably get bongo flavor, which is pop music. It's not hip-hop. In fact, some of the early scholars talked about bongo flavor, like, oh, this is Tanzanian hip-hop. Just like in early South African literature on South Africa, they would talk about Kwaito like it was South African hip-hop. And it was like, no, it's not. It's its own thing. It's the house, that house music. So when Tanzania, there was one scene where an MC that was in the middle of a crowd. That's a hip-hop cipher that happens it used to happen. They stopped doing it every week. And there would be kids from all over the city in Dar es Salaam coming. But there wasn't, one of the things that they were able to do is that they would have these battles, and people around the circle, the cipher, would throw money, and the person who won the battles would take the money. And so that was one way of, young artists getting a little change. But yeah, in Tanzania, it's not a lucrative industry. Most people go into bongo flavor because that's where the money is, and so I think that's unfortunately a lot of places. But I don't know how unfortunate it is, because money tends to corrupt and twist and like, here you have the whole gangster rap thing, that the bling era. So if hip hop is not mainstream, are then artists who are involved in it more free to be expressive and creative? So like jazz, jazz is not mainstream anymore. It once was. I'm not a jazz head, so I don't, but it would, it has that allow artists to be more creative because it's not as marketable as it once was, so, and in terms of women artists, it's definitely women. With women, you see, so, okay, if hip hop is presenting social and cultural and political issues that are going on in that country, the women are making sure that gender issues are also on the table. So you have artists like Sister Fa from Senegal who talks about female genital cutting. Men will talk about it, but it's more in this kind of, oh, stop it, it's not good, don't do it, you're hurting the girls. Whereas she, as someone who was cut and who comes from a village where she's trying to get it abolished, is coming from a whole different perspective. So I think women have been able to add kind of dynamics and layers to some of the issues where, their male counterparts may just kind of touch the surface of.
Hi. I have a question about like your preparation and just like your movement throughout the continent. I'd like to know, like, how did you prepare for this book? When you set out, like, how did you, like, what were like the questionings? How did you infiltrate? I don't want to say infiltrate, but how did you like get into certain like circles to ask questions? Were the questions the same? Because I'm sure it'd be like a little bit different depending on the region that you're going to. Like when I think about hip hop or rap in general, rap out of the South, Miami, is different from rap out of New Orleans, which is different from rap out of Texas, which is different from rap out of New York, So can you just talk about like your preparations and maybe even like your motivation to write a book like this? Thank you.
The preparation, it took several years because I had to do in-country stuff and, money. So I actually had to support, one of my sisters is here who helped me in terms of hotels, helping me book hotels in different places for cheaper. My mother, I just want to say hi, because she, honestly, if it wasn't for people who were, people like her who were able to help me fund my stays, a lot of stuff was just trying to say, okay, I got a few dollars, let me get a plane ticket, let me call my method, see if she can help me get a hotel room. So it was a lot of that, and then you find one or two people, and that's your gateway in. But there were times like you have to do cold calls. So there was this one artist, Reggie Rockstone in Ghana, who his manager at the time, one of his friends was a guy named Daruba, who's a Black Panther. He was in prison for a while. Some of you may have heard about him. He was, I don't know if it was 20 years. I don't know how long Daruba, 19 years. So he sent Daruba to talk to me. So Daruba was a gatekeeper. And Daruba had an issue with academics. And he went off on me, and you guys, and just was cussing me out, and I'm just like, oh. And so you also have to answer to the people who came before you, and you have to be humble, and you have to kind of prove that, you're not going to do the same thing. He just kind of went off, and you Black academics come here, blah, 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 and, and I'm just like, okay, can I just please talk to Reggie? And so, and then he pissed me off, and so we, kind of went back and forth, and to an extent, because Daruba is an elder, and, so I also, if he had been my age, it might have been a different situation, but whatever it was, he kind of gave me the green light. In another case was an artist out of Kenya who came to LA, and we were talking and stuff, and I was playing music, and Redman came on, and Redman, I think it was There Is a Dark Side album, and both of us started, rapping the lyrics, and he was like, what? First girl I've met who knows Redman. And I'm like, There's a Dark Side, that was, that's a classic album. And so that was then my, okay, then, so there's certain things, hanging out at studio sessions, being willing to saying, hey, there's a show, or we're meeting up at the studio at 2 o'clock in the morning. You come in? And I'm like, okay. And so a lot of that is, and leaving that whole PhD thing, like, I'm not coming in as Dr. So-and-so. I'm coming in as Msia, what's up, who you listening to? Here's, talking about hip hop, and not coming in with my, notebook and I'm here to interview you about. So it took a lot of time, and there were certain different artists that made me jump through certain hoops. I just the other day, I'll quickly tell the story. I was at a hip hop festival in Connecticut, and there's a Cape Verdean artist that I want to interview, and he's on the cover of a book that was done on Cape Verdean hip hop. And I hate to throw the brother under the bus, but I was like, hey, is this you? Like, is this you on him? And he misquoted me. Okay, and I was like, okay, well, I read the book. I don't know him. Can we talk? And so he just, him and his entourage kind of went off on the guy who wrote the book. And, so again, you have to kind of compensate for bad relationships that have sometimes been formed.
I wanted to follow up to that particular question, and I was going to save this for the last question. And reading this, honestly, I don't know if I'm reading too much, but it reads lyrically for me. So I wanted to see what you was listening to as you was writing this, because there's like a follow up to that particular question as well.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, interviewing people you're a fan of, it's like, oh, wow. It does sometimes, it is, make you nervous. But listening to their music and being a hip hop head, I think that's kind of growing up in Cleveland, but like kind of being raised on hip hop and just connecting with folks on that wavelength. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty much throughout the whole project. My students here at Howard have kept me up to date with what's happening on the U.S. hip hop scene, because my head has been pretty much on the continent, finding podcasts and finding like SoundCloud and YouTube and finding out who's who on the continent. And then you hear something, you're like, oh, that's dope. Let me see if I can interview this person. So yeah, and that, in terms of the writing, that was one of the pushbacks with the one reviewer specifically, who basically said that ultimately, yes, the book, should be published, but they wouldn't use it for their graduate level class, maybe their undergraduate. And like they meant it as an insult, and I was like, that's great. Like that's what I wanted. Like I wanted it to be something that anybody, anywhere can pick up and not need a dictionary to read it. And so if it's accessible to someone not in academia, then it's accessible to someone in academia. So if you don't want to give it to your grad, that's fine. Like, because it's definitely important that, again, this is a product of the culture and that it's coming from the culture and that it represents the culture. And sometimes the culture and academia sometimes clash, especially in African studies. As you know, African studies is still, hip hop is like, especially older African scholars are just kind of like, I went to one conference and a scholar from Mauritius. So this hippity-hoppity thing is very interesting. And so it's, they just kind of like, okay, this is cute, until you're like breaking down the stuff that's actually happening and the relevance. Then it's like, okay. So yeah, it's definitely interesting.
Thank you for your presentation. Quick question. Next year marks the 400-year commemoration of Africans arriving on the shores of North America in the Virginia, Jamestown, Comfort, Virginia area in 1619. And I'm wondering if you're hearing anything about celebrations, commemorative celebrations on the continent of Africa, hip-hop, bubbling up to that 400-year commemoration.
Unfortunately, no. Ghana will probably be the place where a lot of that will happen, and it will probably come from the diaspora community in Ghana, which is very large and very active. But I do hear about, there are certain things in the U.S. that artists there will kind of jump into the conversation. So I know like when Trayvon was killed, you had several artists who kind of donned the hoodie and did songs about, or in tribute to Trayvon. So you do have artists that are aware of kind of the things that are going on in the U.S. and will speak to that. I don't think that, I haven't heard anything about that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not happening. I mean, I definitely see the diaspora community in Ghana is really good at not only doing those types of things, but also bringing in Ghanaians and doing coalitions.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
Get proud. Thank you so much. Listen.
Yeah.
All my Haitians, my Jamaicans, I rep for my people like a conversation. I'm Zimbabwean, Malian, my Somalians. We're the key to the new era, and it's Guardians, my people.
Peace.